Thank you. Thank you all for coming and all being on time. The speaker today is Gareth Jones, who's a member of the Owen Glendower Society. Coety Castle was built during the Norman conquest of Glamorgan in the late 11th century, and it controlled movement along the coastal plain effectively. But in May 1404 it was put under siege, and it lasted until September, a major event in Owen Glendower's War of Independence. And Gareth's talk is going to be on the background of the siege and the effect of Owen Glendower on us and our life today. Gareth, over to you.
I'm sorry, I'm not used to having a microphone, so I've got to get in the right position, otherwise I'm going to be waving my arms elsewhere. Yes, diolch yn fawr iawn, prynawn da. I'm Gareth, I'm the Secretary of the Owen Glendower Society and have been for over 10 years, 12 years I think. And obviously as such I've done a fair amount of research into Glendower's campaign, so I'm going to concentrate on just one part of it for the main part of the talk, and that is, as mentioned, the Siege of Coety, which lasted from May 1404 until September 1405, so it's 16 months plus, not just in the same year. A bit of background to me. I was born within a couple of miles of Coety. I've lived most of my life within a mile of Coety, and I now live within half a mile of Coety. So by that reckoning, before long I'll probably be in there. I think it needs a bit of work done first, of course. The campaign, this is too high, hold on, make it a bit. I'm a bit shorter than Jeff. The campaign for Owen Glendower started in September 1400 in northeast Wales, in the Dee Valley, between Corwen and Llangollen, a place called Glyndwrdwy. And it was one of the lordships owned by Glendower at the time. And after a fairly successful campaign in northeast Wales, with much destruction of English castles, it all went quiet, but within a few years he'd won a couple of major battles and was basically in control of the whole country by the end of 1403. So before this siege started, a few months before it, he'd managed to control virtually the whole country. Those areas still controlled by the English or run by the English were under attack a lot of the time, and they were afraid to get out of the castle most of the time. And some places, such as in South Pembrokeshire and in the March, they were paying a sort of dingeld, protection money, in order to stop Glendower from attacking. And we think that by the time Coety was taken, or put under siege rather, he'd already taken Harlech, Aberystwyth, Criccieth and a few other castles. And so this was just an extension of that, but in South Wales, which was the big difference. And so what I'm going to talk about is the problems that Glendower had and why he focused on Coety Castle, and also why it was so important to both him and the English king at the time, Henry IV. Okay, let's see if this works now. Hopefully it will work. Yes, right. So we've got a lovely map, a relief map of De Cymru, South Wales, with the see if it works. Oh yes, Banau Brycheiniog at the top, going down through the valleys, the Cymoedd. We've got the lush ground of the Vale of Glamorgan, Bro Morgannwg, and then the Severn, the Môr Hafren Severn Estuary. And if we go back a long time, if we go back over 2,000 years, then it was the Silures tribe that ruled the area, and they obviously had settlements, but also they formed routes. And one of the routes would have gone all the way through the plush ground land of the Vale of Glamorgan. But we know that in the 1st century CE or AD, the Romans arrived, and we got forts like Caerlleon and Caerfyrddin, Carmarthen formed. We also know that they built lovely straight roads, relatively straight roads, and this is one which was probably following an ancient route which the Silures and people before them would have used, but of course it misses all the hills, goes through the Vale of Glamorgan, and it would have connected them. And just like others, the Romans were there to take the mineral wealth of the country. So they were taking the copper, the lead, the gold. Luckily, they haven't discovered the coal, otherwise they'd probably still be here now. But these routes, I mean, a lot of it was transported by sea, but this route was a particularly important one, especially given the number of forts along it. And the name of this is the Via Julia Maritima, or Julius's Sea Road, basically. And it pretty much follows the A48 that we know it today. And so near here, obviously we've got Porthcawl, where we are now. We know that the Romans were there. Obviously we've got that lovely villa being discovered in Margam. And we've got Stormy Down, not far away, which would have been part of that Roman road. But we are going to concentrate on Coety, which, as you can see, is very close to that Roman road. It's only about 3 or 4 miles away from it. And Coety and a few other places were important to control transport along that, which I think Jeff mentioned. Okay, now I'm hoping we get another map. Yes. Obviously, a modern map, we've got the urban sprawl of Bridgend with the industrial estate on the right, but also in that mustard-coloured, dark yellow colour, we've got roughly the A48 as it is today. And this was important not just for Glyndŵr, but also Henry IV, because they needed to be able to talk between various castles and fortified buildings in the area, such as Coety Castle, which was originally owned by, or built by William de Londres with many centuries before, but at the time of the siege it was owned by the Duchy of Lancaster, hence Henry IV himself. And so he was particularly keen to keep it up and running. But Coety and Ogur worked together because in order to get supplies to Coety, then obviously the sea route there, up the Ogmore, a little bit of the way along the Iwenny, they get to Ogmore Castle. But then goods could be transferred between the two, and they worked together on that. As a number of these lords would have had lands over in Somerset, and they get supplies from Bristol, etc. Okay, but these aren't the only fortified buildings. You probably know about Newcastle or Castell Newydd on the hill overlooking Bridgend. But also there's an older castle, called the Old Castle, Hen Gastell, next to Milton Church. Very little signs of it now, but obviously there are signs in the place names. I've obviously highlighted the pub, but there's the school, the council board, the local surgery all bear the name Old Castle, so it would have been significant in bygone years. However, I said that's the route of the A48. The real Roman road, the actual Roman road, wouldn't have followed exactly that path. And if you know the area, as you come down to Bridgend, the road forks off at the Golden Mile and goes through Corntown, Iwenny, and eventually crosses the river. We don't know exactly where, but that road would join up roughly with the A48 as it is today, just beyond Bridgend. And the reason that I put that in is because the other building involved in this story is Iwenny Priory, Fiord Iwenny. And if you haven't been there, it's well worth a visit. The church there has had a lot of work done on it by Cadw in the last few years, and it's very good. And it was built around the same time as Ogmore Castle and the century following it. But as you approach Iwenny Priory, if you haven't been there, it isn't your typical priory. And those walls are particularly substantial, and you wouldn't get in there unless you, especially the gatehouse, you probably wouldn't get through there unless you had a password or were a friend of the person on the gate. And the reason that's important in our story is because Iwenny Priory was used to billet the soldiers of the English army when they came into the area. Consequently, when the English tried to lift the siege at Coety, and they tried to do it twice, once in November 1404, so about 6 months after the siege started, and then more successfully in September 1405, this is where they were billeted. So we know that this was attacked by Owain Glyndwr and his forces, despite the fact that it's a religious house. And there's a few others like that because they were supportive of the English army. They were attacked. Okay, now I'm not going to go through the huge explanation about motte and bailey castles, as I'm sure most of us would have had to draw them when we were in school at some time or other. But in the case of Coety, he was one of those 12 knights, supposedly the mythical 12 knights, that came into the area. Now, there probably only were 4 or 5 knights in the first instance, but under Robert FitzAlan, they came into the area to conquer the Vale of Glamorgan. And if we focus on Coety, it was a fellow by the name of Payne de Turberville who entered Coety, got into negotiations with the local lord, Morgan ap Meirig. And of course, there are 2 ways that could go. Either Payne de Turberville was going to take it by force, or he would take it by marrying into the family. And there's a very good chance that he did. Apparently Sarah, one of Morgan's daughters, married Payne de Turberville. We're not sure what happened. It was probably a mixture of both force and marriage. But he built his castle, Coety Castle, pretty much on the site of the Llys, or the court of Morgan. So it was the Lord of Coety, the native Lord of Coety's area as well. And as with all of these, they identified a water source, a spring or whatever, that had been raised ground, usually, and they'd have built a wooden palisade around it, and that is your motte, or the munt in Welsh. To service that, they had another wooden palisade around the outside, which is the bailey, and that was to make sure that the castle functioned. And they built a ditch around it, building up the bank around it as well. That would eventually fill with water, which has got the lovely colour blue on there. But we also think there's a good chance there was a ditch around the outside of the bailey as well. And all of that was for defensive purposes. It was to stop people from getting in that easily. Okay, so what does it look like now? Well, this is a bit after the siege. This is from a modern Cadw drawing. And you can see that the ditch goes around the castle there. We've got the yellow line, which roughly shows what it used to be. But we think that during the siege, this ditch still went all the way around it. It was a circular ditch around it. And possibly around the outer wall as well. But not all of these buildings would have been there at the time of the siege in 1404. For example, in the inner ward, we'd have had, or the lord of the manor would have, well, sorry, the well, first of all. The spring has been developed into a well. There's no way, if there was a siege, that they'd survive very long without water. They could survive for a good while without food, but it was essential that they had a water source, a fresh water source in there. The lord of the manor then had a hall with quarters above. There was a service range with a kitchen, ovens, there's probably a kiln somewhere around for making things, and possibly a church in there. There would have been a church of some sort. But a bit of luxury as well, because by the end of the 14th century, so in the 1300s, they built a latrine tower, which was a luxury at the time, but was added to the story a little bit later as well. The rest of the buildings, there weren't that many that were there. That northeast tower, for example, or gateway, sorry, that northeast gateway wasn't there at the time on the inner ward, but there would have been a keep or the storeroom, the guardhouse rather, and next to it the middle gatehouse to stop people from getting into that inner ward. In the outer ward, these buildings wouldn't have been there. These are the foundations of buildings that were built later in it. And we don't think that the towers at the southwest and the south wall, that they were there either. But we do think that there was a north tower, and much of it still remains. But the reason that we wanted the north, they needed the north tower, was to keep an eye on what was coming from the north, because that's the most likely place for them to attack, for the Welsh to attack the castle. Okay, have I finished there? Yes. If we were standing at that west gate, because there would have been a west gate there, if we were standing there back in the day, acoustics, sorry about that, and looked towards the inner ward, then we would see something like this, but obviously not the same, because I mentioned that we wouldn't have these foundations, and these buildings in the inner ward wouldn't have been as tall. The chimneys, for example, and the third stories were added at least in the 15th century, later 15th century, and in Tudor times. So, apologies for this, but I've had a go at some art, and this is roughly what they'd be able to see as they entered. In the inner ward, on the left, we've got the guardhouse, we've got the middle gatehouse, we've got the service range with a hall behind it and probably a church and a few other buildings in there, but you can see it's only 2 stories high, so not as tall as it was later. Similarly with the walls, they were a lower height, and also we've still got that moat there. So if somebody broke into that outer ward during the siege, then they'd still have to get into that inner ward in order to take the castle, which wasn't so easy. Okay, now I know you want to see the latrine tower, so there's the latrine tower on the right, and we're talking a bit of chemical warfare here, because this is the ditch running to the left here, and it would have gone up, well, it still goes all the way around that part. And it's pretty deep. It's had infill over the years. It's cleaned out fairly regularly, but it's had a lot of infill. But it would have been filled with water, and consequently any discharges from the latrine tower would have added a bit of chemical warfare into that as well. It wouldn't have been very pleasant to try and get across the moat, let's put it that way. And also we think, because those towers probably weren't there, that this was a solid wall, so attacking from the south wasn't the easiest thing, especially as the land gradually slopes down over a few miles to that Roman road that I mentioned. And so the sensible place for people to attack from was from the north, because the land rises up pretty much to where the M4 motorway is now called, and it's called the Kevin Hirgoid Rise. And so the sensible thing for Glyndŵr and anybody else attacking the castle was to attack from the north side. Okay, right, well, here is a view of the north side. From the field behind the castle, we know that there was damage done to it, because that wall, the north wall of the inner ward, had to be rebuilt, and it was rebuilt at a straighter angle. It wasn't as curved as the original would have been. So we know that was attacked, and also at least that part of the outer wall, possibly more of it. So there's a good chance, and there is a possibility, that Glyndŵr's army used some siege engines in order to hurl their huge stones, trebuchets, etc., and damage it. And I'm going to digress, I'm not supposed to go off at a tangent. But in the summer of 1405, one chronicler has said that a French army went past on the Roman road with Glyndŵr's army, so there were about 5,000 French, best part of 10,000 of Glyndŵr's men went past, and there's a good chance that the French may have had siege engines. So there is some connection there, but there's nothing definite about siege engines. But they were definitely damaged. Right, now for the reveal. We don't think that the people who started the siege at Coety were Welsh. We don't think that it was Glyndŵr's forces. If we look at the family tree, at the top we've got Hein de Turberville, the first of the Normans who came in and built the castle. His nickname was Hythral, the demon. So maybe not the nicest of people. But as with most of the Norman families, they alternate between different names. We've got Gilberts and Paynes, we've got a Richard or two thrown in. And so by the time we get towards the siege in 1404, we're talking about the descendants of this last Hein de Turberville, Hein III, who was a character as well by the sounds of it. But when he died in 1318, his son Gilbert took over the lordship of Coety, He died in 1407, but was followed by his son, another Gilbert, who died only 2 years later. And he died without issue, so no male heir. So instead, from Gilbert. And so the lordship reverted to his uncle, Richard de Turberville. Now, he was Lord of Coety for over 30 years. But when he died, there's a problem because there weren't any male heirs from Richard either. And so then they started looking at his sisters. In other words, the daughters of Payne de Turberville. And the eldest sister, Catherine, had married Roger Berkerose, who was the Lord of East Orchard near St. Athan. Roger died in 1357 to be succeeded by his young son, Lawrence Berkerose. Now, what turned out then was that when Richard died in 1384, Lawrence succeeded, and he ruled, as you can see, until 1411, and so he updated his portfolio, let's say. He gained a fair bit more land. However, he wasn't a popular choice by all accounts, and a number of his neighbours, and possibly some of his relatives in the area, the sort of landed gentry that were alongside him, were not happy with the way that they'd been treated. And by 1404, when this siege started in May 1404, we think that a few of them had taken out that grievance on Lawrence and put the castle under siege. And there's a bit of evidence for this because in the calendar of patent rolls in January 1406, so that's about 4 or 5 months after the siege finished, Henry IV granted to one Robert ap Rhys, who was attached to Ogmore Castle, the sum of £40 a year, which was a good amount of money in those days. And the reason he gave him that money was because his Robert's possessions had been destroyed by Owain Glyndwr rebel. And consequently, he needed the money in order to pay Robert this grant. And he got that money from lands which he confiscated from these 4 people, John of Arran, John Merlo, John Fleming, Isabel Lanfey. And the last 3, we are fairly confident, were involved in the initial siege on Coety Castle. But of course, that was then taken over by Glyndwr, because we think that Owain Glyndwr, at the end of May 1404, was attacking Cardiff, in fact burning Cardiff. He would have heard about this attack, and he'd have moved across in order to take over. Okay, so let's have some pictures now. So this is the field to the north of the castle, up above the castle, looking down, and behind us would be the Cefndir Goedroedd. It's coming down towards the castle. And hopefully you can see in the middle distance we've got this ditch going across, which has got a lot of history in it. But if we look across it, it's a bit like the ditch around the castle, in that there's been a lot of infill over the years. This has been used for agriculture for 600 years plus now, since the siege. And there's livestock in it all the time. There's always cattle and sheep in there. However, if you can imagine that being a bit deeper, this is probably where the commanders, such as Glyndwr and his lieutenants, would have stood in order to look at the castle. And the view of the castle from there would have been pretty good. They'd see the whole of the north side of it. But if anybody was trying to get in or out of the castle, they needed a quick response. And if we move further down the hill, roughly at this area here, so about 50 yards to the north, then I picked a picture, a photograph, which has got the buttercups in it, because I was hoping you'd be able to see the contours of the land a little bit better. But if you can see it, there is dip there, there's a dip, there's another dip. Sorry, I'm a bit shaky with that. But it's as if it's similar, it would have been similar, probably to the trenches in the north of France during the First World War. Very deep. People would have been in there for a long time. I mean, some of them would have been in there for months. And the siege, as I said, lasted 16 months or so. And there would have been barricades across the top because people would have, from the castle, obviously, would have been hurling objects and firing their arrows at them. So yes, we think that Glyndwr was there for some of the time, but there would have been other people joining the siege and taking over and, refreshing the lines, if you like, of the siege. Right, now for another map, as I tend to like those. If you look at the map, this is obviously a fairly modern map, but towards the bottom of the diagram you can see Coety Castle, and you've got to realise that at this time a lot of the areas in Wales it was pretty much apartheid. At the bottom end here, around the castle and to the south, down towards that Roman road, is an area called Coety Anglia, the Englishry, where probably descendants of the first Norman settlers brought in their supporters, their servants, etc., in order to service the castle. But then later, the English would come in and bring in their people in as well. So it was pretty much an anglicised area at the south. And conversely, at the top, we've got Coety Walia. And a couple of weeks ago, I was actually walking near there, and there is a sign still which says Common Coety Walia, Coety Walia Common. And this ranges from, if you know the area, just north of the M4, from Sarn, Brinkethin, Hibkew, that sort of area there. And there's lots of interesting things on that map, which I'm not going to go into, but we've got Carn Gook standing stones there as well. And I've got an image of them. And here they are up on top of the hill, so up at the top of that Cefn Gregoric rise. This is about 20, 30 yards from the M4 motorway. But in the distance, you can see this Iron Age hill fort, Mynydd y Gair. And behind that, of course, you've got Cwmogwr, Cwmgarw, Cwmrondda, all the valleys going up there, and there would have been supporters for Glyndŵr there. And so these stones could well have been, I mean, they've been there for millennia, but these stones could have been a meeting point, focus for people joining Glyndŵr and then replenishing the siege. The trenches putting the castle under siege. So yeah, these could well have been a major meeting point, if you like. Right, well, how do we know about all of this? You know, could be making all this up. However, what we would normally do is rely on the chronicles, because there would have been chronicles written in the religious establishments nearby, such as the monasteries, Mynyddogydd, and the obvious place to look, of course, would be Iwerni, because they'd have had a scriptarium, they'd have had monks scribbling away, writing down. Usually they like to record all the transactions in the area, definitely record all the events, the major events. But unfortunately, from the 1390s to the 1420s, nothing survives from there. And there's obviously a reason, there must be a reason for it. Either well, I said Iwerni was attacked by Glyndŵr's forces, so there's a good chance that all the chronicles were burnt. It could be that the monks hid them so that they didn't get destroyed. They hid them very well by the looks of it. But also it could be that the English forces that came in took them away for safekeeping, and they could be in the cellar in the Tower of London or Windsor Castle, wherever now. But nothing survives from there. So we look a bit further afield. I mentioned Margam, Abati Margam, or Margam Abbey. The abbot in Margam was a supporter of the English king, Henry IV. Whereas a lot of the other Cistercian abbeys throughout Wales were supporters of Glyndŵr's campaign. So it could be that Glyndŵr attacked there and records were burnt, we don't know, but nothing survives. If we go further west, Neath isn't too far away, nothing from there. The more established religious houses, such as at Llanelli Llantwyd Major, Llancarvan, and Llandaf, not a word written on this part. There are chronicles written, but these are by people further afield. So in England, Walsingham, etc., there were accounts of attacks, etc., but these would have all been second-hand. Similarly, in France, there was a French chronicler who wrote about this, and again, couldn't have been there because he was on the continent. We have got a Welsh chronicler that you might have heard of called Adda o Frynviga, or Adam of Usk, and he's credited with writing the chronicles for Glyndŵr's war. Unfortunately, the siege took place between 1404 and 1405, Adam of Usk left for Rome in 1402, went to Bruges in 1406, and didn't return to the British Isles until at least 1408, 1409. And he didn't write his chronicles until a few years later. Consequently, we can't put any liability on. He wasn't a first-hand witness, let's put it that way. So, where do we get our information from? Well, to finish off, you'll be glad to hear, to finish off, I've got a lovely map from 100 years ago, and I'm going to note some of the places we know or have accounts of being attacked by Glyndŵr. We've got the siege of Coety, we've got Caerdydd or Cardiff over in the east, and we know that that was attacked because of records that were written about that. But then near Coety we've got Ogmore. Ogmore was devastated. They failed to pay their taxes for a couple of decades, a generation, they said, after the siege, after the attack, because the area was devastated. We know about Iweni because the soldiers were billeted there. We know about Margam, the abbot wasn't a supporter. Is that my time? Also Coety or Coety Castle. There are accounts of burning from this period in the castle, but as you probably know, this was desolate by now. The sands had encroached on pretty much all of the town, and so that everybody had moved inland. But there is an account in one of the texts that I've read that says it was attacked. Right. Quickly going through the others, we've got Llantrisant, we know it was attacked, St Fagans, Peterston, Superely, the castle at Talavan. A number of the castles in the area were attacked, or there are reports of it. Near Llantwit Major, we've got Plas Trebeferid, or Overton Place, which is an example of a fortified house or fortified manor. And that was just to show that it wasn't just castles that were attacked by Glyndŵr. It was houses. That was a fairly big house to start with, but then it was fortified in order to withstand attacks. But the most interesting one is Llanfleiddan or Llanblethian, next to Cowbridge, only about a mile from Cowbridge. And Llanfleiddan, there's a castle there called St Quintin's Castle, which was attacked. But also in the village, there's a church, St Peter's Church, which apparently was being renovated in the late 1890s, I think it was 1894, somewhere around there. And they broke into the crypt in order to check what was in there. And they were expecting to find a few skeletons from the Seward family of Talavan. However, it was their family crypt. However, they found apparently many skeletons. One report says over 200 of them crammed in there, a lot of them with signs of traumatic deaths, with sword wounds, etc. And they were eventually buried in the churchyard outside. However, it indicated that there must have been a fairly major event nearby. And there is a report of a battle at Bryn Owain, or Stalling Down, near Cowbridge. If you drive along the A48 past Cowbridge, as you're coming up the hill, there's a petrol station on your left, and behind that is Bryn Owain. And it's got a fair amount of history attached to it, but apparently a bloody battle took place there. It lasted 18 hours. The horses were up to their fetlocks in blood. Owain Glyndŵr was on one side, with his lieutenant, Rhysgethin, and Cadogan of the Blood Axe from Cwmrondda. Doesn't sound like, well, from Rome. And against them was Henry IV, who was defeated, and his army were then chased through floods to the east to safety, but they lost their baggage train. So Henry IV lost his baggage train. It was full of the silver, the royal silver, the silver plate cutlery. Apparently his crown was taken. So you might wonder how we get so much detail, some of you will have guessed, how we get so much detail about this particular area and the events. And that's because Edward Williams of Llancarvan, a stonemason, wrote a fair amount about this and included references to these places. And he's better known as Iolo Morgannwg. And if you know about Iolo Morgannwg, then you'll know that some of his stories weren't necessarily as accurate as they could have been. However, we do know that Glyndŵr attacked all of these places, and consequently, there's a very good chance that, as with lots of Iolo's stories, there is a grain of truth in there. So, to finish off, the effect of the campaign. The effect on Coety was obviously that they were at a standstill. They were in lockdown for a year and a half at least, roughly a year and a half. Ogmore was devastated, so the area around it, the fields were burnt, the people were killed, the livestock was killed, and it wasn't just Glyndŵr's forces, because it was both sides that were doing this. And so if it was an English-held castle, you could pretty much guess that it would have been Glyndŵr's forces behind it. But there were a lot of the Welshries that were treated in a similar fashion. And it took generations, as I mentioned, to recover from that. Some people say we still haven't recovered, of course. With regard to Glyndŵr, well, his campaign started to wane after this in 1405. About 6 months later, in 1406, he sent a letter, a famous letter, to Charles VI, the King of France. That's the Pennell letter. And in it, Glyndŵr set out his vision for the future of Wales, with its own church based in Tyddewi or St David's, its own Welsh-speaking clergy, two universities, one in the south, one in the north, and aiming towards independence, of course. Unfortunately, it didn't come out that way for him, because by 1409 he'd lost Harlech Castle, which was the last of his main, his residence at the time. His family were taken to the Tower of London, he disappeared. In 1412, he stepped down from leading the campaign after a few more raids, and his only remaining son, Meredith, took over. And Meredith didn't accept a pardon until 1421 from Henry V. And so there were attacks throughout the 1410s up until then. However, we think Glyndŵr died in 1415, probably whilst visiting his daughters in Herefordshire. Going back to Coety, though, well, when Lawrence Berkerose, the Lord of Coety, who during the siege died in 1411, he again, like his ancestors, died without issue. And so there was another squabble about who should take over. And it was the family of one of his aunts that took over, the Gamage family, and they stayed in Coety until 1584, I think it was, when Barbara Gamage, the last of the line, married the Earl of Leicester, who had properties all over the place, and they moved to Kent. And after that, until Cadw took over recently, the castle fell into disrepair over the centuries. And I think that's all that I know about Coety Castle.
Thank you very much. Fascinating time, for which I knew very little. So thank you. Questions? Anyone? Observations?
No.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Gareth, very much, especially for just widening that at the end about his legacy. I noticed you said that it's possible that he died in Hereford with his daughter, that possibility. And I know there's great uncertainty as to where he was, whether or not he was there or had gone to London or what did happen to him in the end. I wonder if I could just ask if you can link in two things. One is the language, which we've seen the resurrection in recent times. Was the whole of his mission based upon language that he felt identified with the nation? Or in fact, was it something which I don't quite grasp if it wasn't that, because I've always believed that he saw the language extremely strongly, and yet he moved to Hereford, and many others say he went to London and in fact married into some, or at least was protected by wealthy families in London, and wasn't quite the saviour that we all imagined he was. Is that fair or unfair?
Where shall I start? First of all, the language. Glyndŵr was one of the people who was educated. I mean, his father died when he was probably less than 10. And he was taken under the wing of a local landowner and legal advisor, a very important man called Sir David Hanmer. And he was the legal advisor to Richard II. And consequently, Glyndŵr went down to London, to the Inns of Court, and trained to be a lawyer probably for 7 or 8 years. But as for him being looked after by the English, I mean, it was the next lordship, if you like, along from him. It was in Myler, Gwynedd Myler, not Gwynedd Myler, Flint.
Flint.
We'll say Flint. Anyway, to the...
Gwynedd and...
Oh, no, it's the bit that sticks into England just above Oswestry Street, that part that goes in. No, that's getting into the sea, no, further back.
Sorry.
This is my problem, go off at the tangent now. But through his education, he was an Uchelwr. He was the lord in waiting of both Glyndŵrdwy and Cynllaeth up in northeast Wales. So he was, amongst the Welsh, he became the Mab Darogan, the prophesied son who was going to come and take everything back for the Welsh. But he was able to speak, obviously, Welsh, a bit of English. There wasn't a huge amount, I don't think, at the time. Definitely French, and also he wrote Latin. So the 4 languages was not unusual at the time. Well, it was unusual at the time. A lot of the aristocracy would have had 4 languages, but he was able to do that and converse in the different languages. What was the other thing?
Well, then did he move, having had the campaign in his latter years, did he then escape at the end? Because this is what I've heard.
Well,
and in fact was looked after by the, if you like, the English aristocracy.
The time he spent in London was in, I think it was 1376 to 1383.
Not latterly, only in Hereford then.
Well, the thing was, his daughters, he had a number of daughters, possibly 6, but 4 of them married into the Marcher lordship, well, the nobility of the Marches. So the famous one was his daughter Catherine, who married Edmund Mortimer, who died in the siege at Harlech in 1409. Another one was Alice Skidmore, who lived at Kenchurch Court, right on the border near Grosmont in the south. She married John Scudamore, and they had a fair amount of land. Another daughter called Margaret Monington, and it's at one of her houses, she married Sir Richard Monington. It's at one of her houses that we think that Glyndŵr may have died, or at least travelling between 2 of them in 1415. And the other daughter was Sioned, who married Sir John Croft of Coety Castle at the north of Herefordshire, near the border with Shropshire. And so there were a number of, maybe not, they weren't alive when Glyndŵr was there in 1410s, in 1415 or so. But he would have been travelling between his grandchildren's houses probably as well. Yeah. But, yes, there's no record of him going any further than Herefordshire.
Okay.
But we don't know exactly about Vaughan. Obviously, that's part of the mystery of Glyndŵr's story.
And no one's certain where he died, no?
Exactly. And there was a book was written by Professor Griffith Aled Williams about 10 years ago now. I think it was actually 2015 in Welsh, a dyddiau Owain Glyndŵr. And then a couple of years later, it was written The Last Days of Owain Glyndŵr in English. And in that, he laid out his thoughts about what could have happened. And although nothing is certain, it's probable that he died there.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not a question, but I'd like to thank you for your talk today. I'm proud to think I've lived in Coety for 91 years, and I lived right opposite the castle. And my father looked after it for many years after he retired. So we've written a book, A History of Coety
Yes,
Castle.
seen it.
Have you got it? You can have it if you want. You've got it. Right, thank you. And Marilyn invited me to come today because, as I say, I've lived there all my life.
Brilliant.
Thank
You're
you.
familiar.
Excuse me,
Yes.
I'm related to the Skidmores. My mother was Margaret Skidmore.
Yes.
And years ago I was told something about, could be related to Owen Glyndŵr, but it's a little bit different from what you just said, but maybe it's standard. Jack Scudamore was, I was told, Owen Glyndŵr's general or colonel, and he married his daughter Alice Glyndŵr, so she became Alice Scudamore. And I've heard about Kentish Scudamores, and whenever I try to trace the Skidmores, from 1881 back, you've got to look at Scudamore, which is the old English name for Skidmore. So I thought if I can find out Skidmores of the Scudamores, I could be related to him.
Yes, exactly. But the Scudamore, I think it was John Scudamore that was married to Alice. And he was an interesting character because he was given the stewardship of Coety Castle by the English, and then Carrickfergus by the English. And then Glyndŵr's forces attacked Carrickfergus in July 1403. Glyndŵr was negotiating with John Scudamore, and we're not sure whether he was actually married then. He probably wasn't married to Alice until later. But it could have been, there could have been some mutual agreement between them. But also, yes, I think the daughter of Alice and John married into the Dunn family of Kidwelly. Dunn, D-W-N-N. And Henry Dunn was one of the supporters of Glyndŵr. And I think either his son or his grandson married Alice Scudamore. But one of my predecessor as secretary is a lady by the name of Sally Roberts-Jones, and she is doing a lot of work now on the descendants and the family of Glyndŵr and trying to get some certainty into it. So if we find anything, it'll be on our website or on our Facebook page. Okay? No problem.
Thank you for your time.
Can you tell us who was Mrs. Glendow?
Yes, married. Well, some people say Margaret, others say married. She was of Welsh stock. Her father was English, but her mother was Welsh. Her father obviously was Sir David Hanmer, the one that took Glyndŵr under his wing. And so he probably would have met Margaret when he was in London. And if not, probably before he went to London. But they got married in 1383 in the village of Hanmer, which is, as I said, a little bit that sticks into England from Wales. And they apparently had 6 boys and 6 girls. Well, maybe not all of them were with Margaret, but were married. But they had a number of children. And yes, we're not sure where Margaret died. She was captured at the end of the siege in Harlech in 1409, February 1409. Taken to the Tower of London, and there's a record of her daughter Catherine and her children dying there. Sorry, done it again. Dying there, and there's a monument now on the site of St Swithin's Church in London, which was dedicated by our vice president, one of our vice presidents, Sian Phillips. She unveiled it 20 odd years ago now to Catherine, but there's no record of what happened to Margaret, so we don't know where she ended up, unfortunately. There is a rumour that she was actually released back to Wales, but there's nothing confirmed.
Do you think the biggest factor in the failure of the overall rebellion was the withdrawal of the Scottish and French forces? Because he was heavily supported by them,
There
wasn't
wasn't much rebellion.
it? Right, okay.
We cope with uprising. Rebellion.
Right.
Yes, I mean, Glyndŵr wrote letters to the Scots, Robert III of Scotland and the Lords of Ireland at the time, and basically didn't get anywhere. They were already fighting their own battles, I think, against the English it was the main support came from the French. And so really it was when the French... The trouble is, when Glyndŵr wrote his penal letter in 1406, it seems as if there were already secret negotiations between the ambassadors of Henry IV and Charles VI to bring to the end the 100 Years' War. And so consequently, although Glyndŵr had a treaty with him from, I think it was 1404 onwards, by the time they got to 1406, it was fading away. Yeah. So yeah, no, but he did get a lot of support from various English nobility. I mentioned Edmund Mortimer, who was mainly the senior person in the Mortimer family, which was a huge, covered a huge amount of land in Mid Wales especially, but also the Percy family. Now, Hotspur, Henry Percy, was killed at Shrewsbury, the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, but he apparently was already in negotiations with Glyndŵr. But then when Hotspur died, his father, the Earl of Northumberland, took over, and he was involved with a document called the Tripartite Indenture, which was basically, once they defeated Henry IV, Glyndŵr was going to have an extended Wales going across to near Birmingham. The northern half of England would have then been devoted to the Percys and the south to Mortimer. And so there were negotiations still going on. But Mortimer died in 1409. Percy had already died at the Battle of Bramham in 1408. So you know, it was fizzling. It was on its way down, unfortunately.
How different that would have been.
It would have been different. So the thing is, we unveiled a plaque in a place called Six Ashes, or it's between Bridgenorth and Stourbridge in the Midlands of England. And it's much further across the border than we are now. And that's where we think that Glyndŵr, one of the markers for this tripartite indenture, this splitting up of the countries, that would have been a focal point, because apparently there was an Anglo-Saxon battle. The Welsh had beaten the Anglo-Saxons in 633 AD or something like that, and so they wanted to go there. However, when we unveiled this display board there, about half a mile from the site there was a churchyard, and virtually all, well, at least half the names in the churchyard were James or Jones or Davis, or whatever. And of course, up until only a few centuries ago, the language of the area often was Welsh. And so we think that, you know, the modern border, that's where we stopped, if you like. But the Welsh language was being spoken much further than that, a few centuries ago.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.